Welcome everybody to Ed is the middle of media, as in ED. Per what you know already, I won't spend the time talking about the bios of these distinguished gentlemen up here. We had one panelist who couldn't make it, had to fly out. But we're going to go straight in to the discussion. And so I thought, Richard, as someone who's had a lifetime of experience from the publishing end, from boards.
Are you saying my life is over?
No, it's just beginning. And it's, yeah, has there been a sea shift? Is this a changing of the guard in terms of the kinds of companies that are going to be investing in education?
Well, I think there's certainly been progress in terms of how media companies writ large, and we need to define media differently today perhaps than we would 10 years ago. Media to include companies like, perhaps Google and LinkedIn and other companies that are as much tech as media. That ecosystem is bigger on the buyer side now because media is more widely defined. And honestly, there's just more to invest in now, because if you go back a few decades, really the only media involved in education was textbooks and ancillary materials and occasionally film strips and maybe some other stuff along the way. But there's been a flowering of different kinds of media as it approaches both K-12 and higher ed, where there's just more interesting things that seem more in the orbit of media companies to look at. The second thing is that there's been a bit of an expansion of how for-profit companies interacted with education in general. And we've had some ups and downs, certainly, with for-profit education as running schools. But in general, the for-profit nature of the ways you could integrate with education has widely shifted, and you see a couple of companies up here already that represent some of those shifts, where there are different places you can apply private capital to actually create a reasonable business system, where before you basically had the academy or you had a K-12 environment and you could plug in some content, mostly through textbooks, but that was really all you could do. Now you have a wider opportunity, so there are many more media companies looking at it, and some more media companies, including my old company, Bertelsmann, who are stepping forward and putting some big checks into this environment, one of which
that serves it up very well
on
for
my
you,
right.
Edward.
So, I'll set the table there and let you guys take it.
And just as we're talking about setting the table, I think important for this panel, so many, we can segment this thing. You've got U.S. investments, you've got international investments in terms of education, you've got pre-K-12, you've got higher ed, and then you've got, let's call it lifelong learning, but all these are very different markets. But that's the perfect handoff. So you were the, I guess, proud recipient of a very healthy round, with Bertelsmann taking the lead, $250 million on that round.
Yeah.
Share with us how you approached that round. Did they choose you? Did you choose them? Was a match made together? And how did you approach that, the media landscape?
Sure. Well, just to be plain about the second question, I mean, I don't think anybody invests $230 million into a business without sort of both parties coming together and realizing that there's really deep alignment between the vision that the leadership team is executing on and the belief system at the company making the investment. And so, for us, what we were really focused on is how do we get prepared and in position to scale into this moment for the industry, and how much capital and what kind of partner is really going to amplify what sort of our team is capable of producing. The education business is very much a content and services business, right? You have a faculty person who provides one of the critical pieces of the services, but there's also enrollment, admissions, and student services, and all of this combination of content and services to help traditional nonprofit universities succeed online it's a very big idea. It's an idea whose time has come. It's global in nature because of the outside demand from the outside of the U.S. demand for access to U.S. degrees, and Bertelsmann was the perfect partner when we started to think about sort of who would be the right match
Why?
to help us
Why?
to help us express this value proposition at a global scale. Bertelsmann has, I think, 1,500 investments in 50 countries around the world. They are, in and of themselves, a global operating platform for businesses to succeed. We met with a lot of great investors, some super thoughtful people. We met with some other media companies. There was something really unique and differentiated about Bertelsmann as an enterprise. And again, a pure alignment of vision and a belief that a long-range horizon is a strategic advantage in the education marketplace. And they were ready to invest for decades, and the Fields family and our other stakeholders were really focused on the same thing. How do we point at the horizon and execute on a plan that has decades of work in front of it?
And when you were looking at potential investors, were there various sectors that you were pulling in to look at? Was there, when you were sitting down with your bankers and folks, did you say media companies, publishing companies, let's winnow down the list?
Well, look, there's always sort of the strategics and the financial investors. We looked at both. We met with pure financial investors. The time horizon there is very different. 5-7 year, sort of flips are required. And we looked at strategics. And again, what was so powerful about the opportunity to partner with Bertelsmann was both the international capability, but more importantly, the shared vision for a long range, a long horizon, sort of investment strategy.
Right. David, you've been dealing with media companies in terms of some of your investors, in terms of being Hollywood-centric. Tell us about that experience and how they came to you, you came to them, and again, the approach in which you took in looking for investors.
Yeah, I think choosing investors is something that you don't always know how important it is up until you have to be on a board with them, and then they impact your life quite a bit. And before this, I invested, so I saw what it was like to be an entrepreneur and have a really bad board. So we wanted to choose investors that believed in the mission. Also, we're going to be sort of pro-entrepreneur, right? And so, kind of in this world, we chose ones that were some great tech investors who do care about education. We also went with Michael Bloomberg's fund. They are fantastic and have thought a lot about the intersection of education and media. That might kind of seem strange, but if you think about what Bloomberg does, especially on their media side, it's actually a lot about education and informing. And then in terms of more Hollywood money, that actually wasn't us looking for it. You start to sign a bunch of names, and people start saying, "Wait, I want to be part of that," or "I want to help out on that." And it's really helpful in entertainment to have those folks involved. That helps every part of our business.
Richard, do you see, are we getting near a tipping point in terms of the education space? You look at a conference like this, all of us that have been coming here, you've been here since probably the inception with Michael and Deborah, so 3,500 plus folks. Does it feel like a bubble, or does this feel sustainable?
Every year, the same question is asked, does this feel like a bubble, if you guys have been here in any previous years? And every year, it does feel like a bubble, but the next year it is bigger. And there are several reasons for that, and we'll have macroeconomic cycles that affect this as well, but I think the key reason, and this came up a little bit in the HotChalk answer about Bertelsmann, is that education has a wildly interesting future and is one of the few business areas globally that you can count on to grow in general, like healthcare, just because of population and mega trends. But it's also a get-rich-slow scheme. It is not the kind of quick turnaround Silicon Valley immediate ramp type of investment that that leads to really wild boom and bust cycle swings. So if we are going to be addressing the biggest problems that are facing education both in this country and globally, and you put those in big buckets like cost being a bucket, efficacy being a bucket, and how is private capital going to address itself at that in K-12 or in pre-K or in career training or in high school to college transition or in higher ed. These are big issues that are going to take a long time to tackle. And to the extent that we do have innovation, particularly digital innovation, that's effective in tackling them, this kind of conference is going to go on for a long time, and we are going to keep asking if it's a bubble, but there'll be continual financing coming into it because the scale of the problems are so big. If you can solve them, the wins are very big too. It just takes a long time. And it might take companies like Bertelsmann or like Hearst or traditional media companies or larger companies that have long agendas like Google or LinkedIn or whoever to do that kind of really patient investing that's the best kind of investing for this market.
For all of you, a question. Social impact. Do you think that part of the expansion in terms of funding for education is just like in, you look at the NBA, it's sort of a vanity thing for billionaires that they want to have an NBA team. Do you think that in terms of social impact, the ability to have a demonstrable impact in terms of education, we're going to see more investments because of the social good?
Oh, I'm all about the vanity. I'm only in it for that reason. I don't know about you guys. No, I think you do have, and you heard from Bill Gates, I think, you have people who are passionate about this because of their own personal experience with education and because, the fact is that education is one of the few levers we can pull that really can make a difference societally. So, I think this has been true from the beginning, and certainly, I have a publishing background, and people in the educational publishing side came into that business to make exactly this kind of difference, where you are affecting the destiny of a kid or quite a number of kids, and that psychic benefit is one of the reasons you stay in the industry. That's the same psychic benefit you get as an investor. That may not lead to the most disciplined investment orientations, but it certainly will lead to an awful lot of stick-to-itiveness on the part of the investment community because they'll feel the same thing.
Go ahead.
I think funds that invest in impact, I actually don't understand, because if you measure impact, except for very exceptionally low income, you should measure success. I think. If the market can solve a problem, then it creates a solution that lasts for a really long time. So I think the market, you should try to first use the market in order to solve a problem. The time when you should have a fund that invests for impact should be when there is some structure in the market that it can't be solved, right? So this often happens at ultra low income, right, where you can't make any money. So that's where I don't actually understand any impact funds that don't invest at that stage. Because I don't think you're actually, if it was going to help the world and be a good business, you would get picked up by some other vehicle or fund.
Edward, thoughts?
Look, people who are working in education do it because it's something worth getting up in the morning and going to work on beyond just shortening the supply chain at a computer manufacturer or turning inventory faster at a retailer because you've got the latest enterprise software. I think social impact is something that most folks working in education care deeply about. I certainly do, and by that way, that was one of the things that sort of deeply resonated with us about the folks at Bertelsmann, right? I mean, they're intensely focused on making the world a better place. And by the way, educated consumers in emerging markets, growing into the middle class, have a lot more dollars to spend on the things that the middle class spends. So, education is also a driver for more consumption and great profitable consumption of more media.
Yeah. Fast forward 5 years from now. Who are the companies that are putting serious stakes down in the education space?
Or the producers, you said?
No, the funders.
Who are the companies that, yeah.
I mean, are we talking, again, as we think through media companies, as Richard correctly said, like very different kinds of media companies. So we see LinkedIn moving into career placement. We see companies like eHarmony moving into career placement. And we see a lot of universities.
Is eHarmony moving
they've
into career
moved.
placement?
They've created
What's the career?
And they've got an algorithm that they think is going to work.
Wow.
But we also see at the same time, we see universities saying we have to provide better outcomes and be able to place our students, and so they're into the career piece. What are the types of companies that you think, whether it's a LinkedIn, whether it's a traditional media company, whether it's a publisher, what do you see of the companies that will be wanting to invest in the education space?
Yeah, I mean, you know, people have asked a lot about where are the giant technology strategics in terms of investing in, you know, sort of education. We haven't seen a lot of it, and I think there are open questions about, you know, sort of why that happens.
Why?
You know, look, education is different in many ways, and in one sense it's different in that, you know, sort of teachers matter. Faculty matter a lot. A lot of the technology that's been built over the last 30 years and deployed at scale is built and deployed to improve efficiencies by driving human capital out of the equation. That's great in all kinds of industry. It doesn't work in education because we actually need great teachers. And so, I mean, you know, the big companies that'll be writing big checks 5 years from now, I'm not sure. Well, I don't know. I do think that while it feels a little bubblish because, you know, sort of every year we keep coming back and the event is larger and, you know, sort of there's more dynamic energy around it and there's more, you know, sort of thoughtful companies, CEOs and teams that are doing great work. But, you know, when you stop to think about it, I mean, education is $1 trillion marketplace. We are just getting started in terms of connecting the dots between, you know, sort of capital arriving at the point of attack and, you know, sort of entrepreneurs arriving with interesting, you know, sort of ideas. So, look, I think this event is going to continue to thrive in the years ahead because it is a giant, it is $1 trillion marketplace on a global scale. It's $600 billion of tuition in the United States alone. I think we're just getting started, and I look forward to seeing you all here next year with another 1,000 people added to the gang.
Gentlemen,
Yeah, actually, they're switching to Madison Square Garden next year, so I hope you all appreciate that.
Richard, any thoughts on you looking into the crystal ball? You know, and again,
Yeah,
we look at some of the companies. You know, when you had Pearson here talking about where they've been, you know, selling off some of their key assets and have been making that shift for quite some time. What are the trend lines that you see?
Well, you know, Pearson has you know, slimmed down a lot of its units. It really didn't have much to do with education. Some did where they didn't want to focus on that particular area. But you know, that's a long story. The question really was, which are the very large media enterprises that we can expect to be writing big checks into the ed community? And I think you'll have some that do so because their natural growth markets are constricted and they like to see $1 billion, you know, $1 trillion market. Sorry, I didn't mean to take 3 zeros off. $1 trillion market potential out there that they can really grow into. So, you know, I was at dinner last night with a guy from IBM. They have this Watson project that you guys probably all know about. The application of that project to education is interesting over time, as is AI generally in terms of being able to really service the individual needs of students potentially and to flip classrooms and things like that as you get to much more adaptive kinds of educational opportunities than we see today. And even today, they're a lot better than they were a few years ago. So I think you'll see companies like IBM. I think you'll see companies like Google. And I think, you know, for sure, I think you'll see the more traditional media players, the Bertelsmanns, as you can see here, but really the ones that are not under attack, that have the ability to dream a little bit, and those are mostly private companies. Bertelsmann is a private company, Hearst is a private company, Advance is a private company. All of those have made decent size investments into education in the last 12 months, or certainly in the last 18 months. So those are the kinds of companies that I would look at. Public companies have a little trouble not being uni-focused on a particularly profitable segment that they do very well. And I think that trend continues. You'll see companies split apart and focus that are in the public markets. But the private markets companies with a longer time horizon, are probably your investment cast here.
David, thoughts?
Yeah, I think you'll see more from traditional entertainment, places where you actually, how do I say this? You'll see it more from the Disneys and HBOs, places where you now go to watch more entertainment. You'll start to see, because if you look at how much time people are spending to watch stuff online, it's now increasing to about 4 hours a person. If you ask them, about a third of them are going online to watch something because they want to learn something. So if I have these people are coming and looking for stuff, I'm going to start to move a little bit more in the education area. You already start to see a little bit like Netflix. If you see how many docs they now have on there and how they have TED now on there, right? It's getting a little more on the instructional edutainment side. So I actually think you'll start to see it from more places that you're used to seeing more on the entertainment side.
But even on something like that, so Netflix, you have someone like Reed Hastings who's passionate about education.
Yeah.
He's made a few standalone investments, Dreambox and a few others. Why don't you think, with his resources, with their ability to change markets, why haven't we seen someone like that and Netflix go all in?
The market would punish them brutally for taking this sort of orthogonal.
Back to you, but as a publicly traded,
Yes.
so that.
But
so
not if they bought education content that went on to Netflix.
No, I'm talking about if
they
they
did
if they
separate
decide to
investment,
buy HotChalk, for example, paying many times the multiple, of course, that Bertelsmann did. The market would punish them egregiously, I think, and that's why they really don't have the scope as a public company to do those orthogonal moves. Even if he's passionate personally about it, I don't think that's open to them.
So the publicly traded pieces, a different kettle, a different pocket than the private equity folks.
In today's market, I think that is true.
And do we see any fundamentals changing on that as more companies move into the space?
Well, I think one way to look at it is, I'll give you my sort of confetti view of education, which is to the extent that education becomes disaggregated in the same way other media have become disaggregated. The music industry has become somewhat disaggregated, and the cable model is becoming disaggregated. If we look at that with educations with institutions basically granting micro degrees and the whole thing sort of thrown up, and you get to pick what education you want, what point of education you want 10 years from now from what institution on what model, and it really is kind of a free-for-all. It's the sort of West Coast view of the future of education. That is a real opportunity for media, because media comes in and they say, we can do this in a more attractive way, in a more engaging way than these traditional companies are trying to do it. And since it is a free-for-all and there's no academy that is a gatekeeper, we're going to just be better at it, and the consumers of education will come to us. And to the extent that that is the future of this industry, I think that's a ripe future for media companies. I think there's a lot that, and I'm an East Coast guy, so I think there's a lot arrayed against that West Coast possible future of the confetti of education. And so I'm not so sure I'd personally subscribe to that or try to underwrite it as an investor.
Virtual reality, an example of where, again, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of buzz out there. A lot of folks think it's going to be a huge tipping point for education apps. What do you guys think?
We are exploring stuff. So we do courses online with the best in the world, right? So give an example. We have a class with Kevin Spacey on acting right now online, right? And so you can imagine, like thinking of like a class from Seinfeld, where you want to learn how to get over how to deal with hecklers. So you can imagine to learn, right, that you do some VR, right, in Google Glass, or on the Google on their cardboard, where you actually put it on and you get a room of hecklers, and you have to respond to it, right? So how do you actually put somebody in that scenario where that person actually uses it to actually learn? It's I think for some things it's really fantastic. It is still expensive, and it is not. The stats on the people who actually use it is still quite small.
Yeah.
Any other vehicles?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that, because KKR has an investment in a a company called Magic Leap, which is.
Are you going to tell us all about Magic Leap? I would love. It's
yeah,
really hard to hear anything.
Yeah, let's abandon this whole conversation. Go with Magic Leap. I think you'd all enjoy that. No, but I think if you look at augmented reality, which is basically not your entire field of vision, but you can see what you see out there, but there's stuff that is digitally imposed into your field of vision that sits along with the reality you see. That is an interesting arena for education, and I'm not going to say that it's because you can demo what an earthquake looks like right in front of you and have a lot of drama. You can do all that, but what it really allows is the social part of education that's so key that we talked about with the teacher to student. In an augmented reality environment, the teacher doesn't necessarily need to be there physically, and students don't. You can see a whole classroom of students and kind of interact with them. When you're all wearing glasses, and you don't necessarily need to be that physically, and that may ultimately be a pretty strong change agent to the far future of education, and allowing a lot of people that wouldn't have the benefit of great teachers or one-on-one instruction or other things to get that in a virtual world.
How much do you guys think? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want?
I was going to say I think it's really early to tell. I can think of several instances where a technology came along. I mean, even the U.S. mail was used for correspondence courses, and then there were sort of programs on radio, and then of course there was NPR and TV where sort of classes were being delivered on TV.
A lot of false starts.
Well, not false starts, but sort of complements to the existing ecosystem and how it's delivered. The one thing that maybe VR makes possible that none of these other sort of technologies produced was the idea that you could actually be in relationship with a teacher, right? So I've been at this for about 10 years, 11 years with HotChalk, and the most humbling thing about the experience was the realization about 5 years in that teachers really matter. They are way more important than we as technologists want to acknowledge or admit. And we have to start talking about and thinking about, and Bill Gates talked about this a little bit today, that the most powerful technology we can unleash into the education ecosystem is something that really helps teachers get more done with less, brings data around meeting the student where they are, and maybe skips over some of the other stuff that we've seen. I don't know about VR. Very, very early.
You view yourself as a technologist?
Totally. Born and bred. I dropped out of graduate school in was it 1980, 1982 when Time magazine named the PC Man of the Year, and I went down to a Xerox store and I bought an Osborne instead of a car, because I wanted to be part of what I believed was a revolution and a coming revolution in mass media.
So in terms of technology, for all three of you, we've had, if this was 3 or 4 years ago and MOOCs that was the big buzz, they were going to transform education and the business models, and 3 years later, the crescendo is turned into a decrescendo. But it was enabled by technology, right? You could have large, hundreds of thousands of folks taking courses, but as you said, there had been correspondence courses before. This was not anything new. Where do you see technology driving the changes in the fundamentals of investments for education companies? If not VR, where?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to get to science fiction to see where some of these fundamental changes are, and MOOCs are an interesting one because, yeah, you can view MOOCs as a failed experiment if you want, but MOOCs have forever changed.
Absolutely.
How we're going to be delivering education.
And in terms of access, it made a real difference.
And if you talk to any higher ed institution, they're thinking about how to deliver education in a very different way, partially because they've seen the trajectory of MOOCs, good and bad.
Right.
And I think, to your earlier point of how technologies get adopted, sure, when film was born, what they would do is film a stage play, right? That's exactly what they did, and that was early television as well. They didn't realize the language of that technology and the language of that media could offer something completely different. And whether you're looking at the technology that enables MOOCs or the technology that enables VR or AR, those languages we haven't really figured out yet. And the same way that, you know, we're still filming the stage play. But I think we will over time, and these are, you get brilliant people, you'll get investable theses that come along with that.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me that has everybody here tried a MOOC before? Mm-hmm. How many of you have finished the class you started? Yeah. So like,
well, that's about the right ratio.
That's about the right thing, right? So like we still
Did you get a badge? Did you get a certificate?
So we still have a lot to do to actually improve the quality of online classes. A bit of it isn't even tech, it's just like effort and the types of people associated with it. So just when you start tech, you know, the first people that come are the nerds. Imagine when you get people that have won Oscars to actually shoot online classes, right? Imagine when the online classes aren't shot by a webcam in the back of a classroom, right? But are as engaging as something you watch on HBO. Imagine when you actually use your phone to actually do things with, right? We are trying now on the Christina Aguilera, so we have a class by Christina Aguilera for singing, and we're actually trying to do it that you actually sing in your phone, and it tells you what note you're singing, and like that's something like, I don't know if you ever tried to take a singing class. I always did. I could never understand when everybody said I was off key because I couldn't hear it, but at least now I do it on my phone and it says I'm off key, so at least I can adjust it. So I think we'll start using our phone. I think one of the most interesting things you'll see at a Stanford in one of their education schools there is that they have a hypothesis that the world has changed in education, where before the hard part was to actually get the information, and now that's very easy for somebody to get. So you're trying to create out the opportunities where somebody wants to go get that, right? How do you create those things that the kid wants to go learn? So I think trying to use tech to kind of excite or ignite that is where you're going to see it a lot. So that's not actually like very far out. It's just starting to use the tools that we have.
So you mentioned a name, so someone like Christina, that's a brand.
Christina Aguilera, yes.
I'm curious about what brands, how much do brands matter in terms of the investment? So as we've listened to a lot of, so if you look at 2U, when they went out to market, they had extraordinary brands that had been around for 100+ years, the USCs, the Georgetowns, et cetera. How much do brands matter when you're investing, Richard?
Well, for a model like that, they matter tremendously because that's a kind of brand-led, in some cases a little bit of a trickle-down approach, because if you have the top brand in ed schools, it may be a winner-take-most market where, yes, you can actually take that ed school population from graduating 150 kids a year, or whatever it was before 2U started with Rogier, to graduating 2,000 kids a year. And in terms of people who are willing to pay for a top-level ed school education, that may start creaming an awful lot on a percentage basis, so you want to have brands there. If you look at a company like General Assembly, you know, they're creating their own brand, and pretty effectively as a first mover that delivered quality enough to, you know, have brand adherence. I think that's also tremendously important to me as an investor. I look for that. I think there are plenty of models within education where the brand is not out front, and there are models where, you know, you're really looking at stuff that's in the plumbing that's equally important and profitable that we would underwrite, but it depends on, you know, where you're plugging into this ecosystem.
Edward, brand,
you know,
you spent a lot of time thinking about this.
Yeah, so. I mean, look, when you don't have a lot of information to go on about a product that you're buying, brands can be really helpful, right? Because it can, you know, you can sort of extrapolate what, you know, sort of you're curious about or what you're concerned about when you go make a meaningful investment decision. I think the world is turning in education, and people are shifting from, well, I don't know a lot about that school and what happens, so I'm going to focus on the brand because, you know, that's the best information I can get. You know, we're getting better transparency in education today, and we're certainly getting better transparency in higher ed. Consumers are going to be much more focused on the real outcomes, the real career outcomes, the return on education investment that students are getting. And that's when sort of the brand equity in some of these schools will begin to break down, because ultimately if you can get the outcomes that you're looking for, if you can produce a return on education investment, frankly at a lower price than what you'd have to pay to go to that brand school, a lot of consumers are going to choose the outcomes-based data instead of the brand. Now, that doesn't change the fact that some of these wonderful schools and these branded sort of opportunities like in 2U aren't enormously valuable to the students that go to them. But there's a very large market out there of folks who are focused on the outcome, not necessarily the brand, and in some cases are more price sensitive.
Clearly, 2U has thought about that in terms of making sure that the programs sort of match the brand in terms of high quality. Curious, off of that branding piece, when you have thought about the challenges and the way you approach the market, what are the brands from the communications companies that could value it? So you thought about Bertelsmann, great, you did the investment. Going the other way, when you're looking at companies now to invest in, to buy, how are you approaching now, the hunter piece in terms of as you look at companies that you want to add to your portfolio that can value add to your company, because now you're not just an education company, you're a media company.
Yeah. Well, look, we just have a very, very student-centric view of the world. Everything that we evaluate is evaluated against the information available about how well they help students and the difference that they make in the lives of either the educators or the students that they serve. And brand, frankly, is irrelevant.
Brand for you? You've taken the names and you've been able to run with it. How far can you run with the names?
It's a great question. We thought that starting with like the best in the world allows you in the future to bring on people that maybe are less well known and have less of a brand, but you now trust that anybody on that platform or site is one of the best. So it was very strategic of us to start there. I think in education it becomes more important because it's harder to judge the quality, and especially in online classes, there's hundreds of thousands of online classes. How do you establish that this person's actually really good? Helps if you know that person. We sell to our students, but also to our instructors, right? So if I'm Kevin Spacey, I have to feel comfortable to teach on the site, right? And so he cares about who else is on there and the quality of the education and the reputation it has. Investors were helped a lot. Having a Michael Bloomberg involved was very helpful when you're trying to sign up the first few instructors, because that's somebody who they trust and know. Consumers, they care much less about who your investors are. But I think brand for us is incredibly important and growing.
An unsolicited piece of advice for him, if he can give little tidbits of what's going to happen in the next season of a certain TV show, that might get a lot of people would be willing to pay $100, $200. Who's going to die? And you get education, but you get that extra. So just kidding. On the branding, curious, when you have looked, Richard, at companies and the changing of I assume that part of this has been B2B has been always a hard place when you're dealing with districts. And so large companies, publishers, it is a hard piece to, but
yeah, so you're in the world of K-12 now, right? Brand actually does matter in the world of K-12, but your brand is really represented by your sales force and the history of quality that you have with the publications that you've done in that arena. When you're looking at brand new, sort of out-of-the-box digital stuff that is trying to create a brand for itself in that community, you really need to harness the power of word of mouth of teachers to get the brand going. So, a company like Newsella, for example, the reason that is, going on to some decent success at the moment and really resonating is because it's all teacher word of mouth. They could not have imposed that brand onto schools or districts, it would take them years.
And are you seeing the impact that you think that kind of word of mouth, that buzz is able to dramatically change the kind of investment strategies? I assume part of the shifting of the sands has been because B2B was so hard, but with people being able to go viral, being able to go through on the B2C end, driving that, whether it's the teacher, whether it's the parent, whether it's the student, to activate them changes the model a little bit.
I think it certainly does. There are more hours in your quiver to apply to try to get to the kind of market acceptance and market awareness that you want to have with that. But I will say, and a cautionary note for the audience here, when you look at business models that are, for example, B to B to C, or where you're trying to sell, something is free to teachers so that the students can take it to their parents, so the parents can buy something. These are really, really hard models to make them work. I mean, in the history of the education business, it's happened maybe once or twice. Scholastic book clubs is probably the only example I can think of. So it's really, you have to think pretty carefully about what your model is if you want to go for some virality that's free here to try to, go into a different environment for a paid business model. It can be tricky in the education community.
So you mentioned thinking about K-12, and again, early on we talked about breaking this down. Do you have sweet spots that you care about? K-12, higher ed, international markets, certain countries? How do you approach your investment strategy?
Well, I'd like to say I'm an equal opportunity investor. There are, what the sector is, to me, is not as important as who the management team is, what the business model is, what the approach is, and do they have something that's unique and protectable. I think there's plenty of plays in each of the markets that you mentioned, plus others in corporate training, and God knows, there are a whole lot of other people who are represented here in the audience and certainly at the wider conference. There are great business models in all of these arenas that are investable. There are just not many of them. And that's the issue. There are many people here, many entrepreneurs here, and like any other venture community, your odds of success are low. Yes, out of every 10 ventures, there will be 2 that do fine. There'll be 1 that does really well, and the rest of them, they're going to do something else with the rest of their life.
So maybe that goes back to when we were talking about the bubble here. Maybe the numbers are going up, the numbers of folks coming up with the ideas, the businesses. But percentage-wise, is there going to be there's a leveling off in terms of the numbers of companies that will be able to succeed in the space?
Well, you're already seeing it. It may be a little short term, but the last quarter there's been a lot less capital financing going into education, venture, startup, and growth than there was a year ago. And that decline is relative to an overall market decline, I think, in terms of support of notional business models rather than actual business models. And so the public market has gotten disenchanted with that particular notion, and that has trickled down to the private markets as well. So it's harder to get things financed this year than it was last year. Mm-hmm. The multiples and the notional values are lower this year than they were last year. It's great to have financed something 12 months ago. It is not great to be looking for financing for something today. And that, there's still financing going on. It's still a great conference. We still got a lot of heat and light in this arena. But we do have, there are ebbs and flows, and they tend to go with the stock market a little bit and with, what the flavor of the month is.
But for the audience, are there certain indicators that you look at? So traditionally, in olden times, it was, even when it was a down economy, people would be going back to get their continuing education. They would be going back to school. So there were certain sectors in education that would do well. Do you look for certain indicators that are different and unique for the education space that people want to invest in?
Well, in terms of economic cycles, there are certain parts of education that are counter-cyclical, and that's great, or anti-cyclical, where you have a lot of people out of work. They tend to be engaged with education because they're trying to do something to improve their prospects for work. Those characteristics are important as an investor to try to figure out what is your recession case. But I would say in the environment we're in here, that is generally overwhelmed by the team and the nature of the business model and other things. So the macro side is going to be important to look at, but not a driver of an investment decision, because the macro, particularly if we're looking at this as a global business, the macro is great. Let me tell you, yeah. We are going to have more people who are going to need more education over a longer period of their life. I think we've heard it from a lot of people at this conference, no question about it. And so, I can underwrite the macro easily. It's the micro that's tougher.
As we go into the final round, just get each of your thoughts back to the basics of the question before us. Media companies, I know you thought maybe not so many media companies in terms of your perspective. What do you see as in terms of short-term, long-term, in terms of the investments coming into education and things that will be inflection points that will change things for this audience?
Yeah, it's really hard to find on a macro scale increase in funding from folks inside entertainment into education. On a macro, I found it tough to find those trends. What we have found, just based on our own experience, is lots of these companies are looking for other ways to earn money. They're looking for other ways to engage a younger crowd and audience. This is like the acquisition of maker studios, things like that. And as education becomes more and more like something that you watch on TV, there's something very interesting about it. Somebody is willing to pay a tremendous amount of money to get 1 hour of education. They're willing to spend about $3 or whatever it is to watch 1 hour of a TV show, right? So I think a bunch of these companies are starting to see that there's an arbitrage, right? Which lends itself to them being extremely active in the space. It lends the fear is that it's actually not that educational, it's more edutainment.
Edward, as the most recent recipient of a big chunk of change, share with the audience your suggestions in terms of the market.
Well, look, I believe deeply in the notion that a long-range horizon really matters in education, right? 3, 5, 7-year turns on capital can be really tough to manage in a business where the runway has to be long. So, I think one of the things I like about media companies as a source of funds is they tend to have a long-range horizon. They're dealing with millions and millions of consumers. They've got a relationship with them, and to the extent that they can monetize those relationships by expanding the offerings available to them, they're a great place to do that, and there's leverage in their model for the entrepreneur that's trying to build something.
And Richard, closing thoughts as the resident expert on this panel on investing. Advice for the group. They're all going to go out here and try and invest as you say, but tell us about what you see in your crystal ball in terms of the education space as the pieces that you would most likely suggest that they go towards.
Well, I'm going to go back to something I said earlier. Education is a get-rich-slow scheme, so those who are here for mercenary reasons, who want a quick flip, even if you get a early financing, it's a pretty frustrating experience to try to keep expecting that year after year when the build is slower than it is in certain other markets. My best advice to the other investors in the audience, if there are any, is that you pay pretty close attention to how well matched a team is with what they're going after. Because there are some great ideas. And you fall in love with the idea, but if the team's not right, it's going to fail. And there are some great teams, and they are totally persuasive, and you can absolutely underwrite them, but if the idea is not perfect, they're going to fail. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And then last lightning round for everybody. Any particular roll-ups that you see? Will you see an Apple, a Google, a Facebook doing investments in education that both burnish the brand, probably even more importantly to them in terms of, because education is that good housekeeping seal, that there'll be major investments that create that sort of tipping point?
Maybe. Sorry. I know you wanted something definitive.
These companies, have a little bit of a not invented here syndrome. So I think they're making investments in this area. Certainly Google is. In terms of major buys and roll-ups, not necessarily their style, and they're going to be a little bit worried about the regulatory implications of some aspects of it.
So we got a maybe there. 2 maybes. Last round. Yes, no, or maybe?
No.
No. There you go. Well, thank you, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this panel. Thank you, panelists. Really appreciate it.